Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Hello and welcome to Brave New World. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. September 11, 2001 is a day I won't ever forget. I watched the World Trade Center towers crumble from my floor on Bleecker Street. For months after that, I watched people weep on the streets around me. It's when mainstream America became aware of Islam. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World had little room for religion. In our world, on the other hand, religion is still quite prominent and has been associated with a fair amount of conflict globally over the last few decades. Helping us make sense of modern Islam and where it's going is Bernard Haykel, professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Bernard is a long-standing scholar of Islam and will help us understand it and its complex relationship with the rest of the world. Bernie, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I just thought we'd start with your journey. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and how did you become a scholar of Islam?
So, as you know, I'm a professor at Princeton University in what we call Near Eastern Studies, which is what we call the Middle East. And it's broadly the entire Arab world, plus Iran and Turkey, and into Afghanistan and Pakistan. And some of us even work on India, which is where I am right now. And I grew up in the Middle East, and I grew up in Lebanon, where I experienced a civil war between different communities, Christian and Muslim, and different ideological groups. And I had a kind of premonition that the Middle East was going to remain very chaotic and politically unstable, and that religion would probably, or would be invoked, would be used in that political tussle between different communities. And then I got an opportunity I'm a political junkie, I got an opportunity to study a country called Yemen, which is in South Arabia, and it's a country that's never been colonized. And I was particularly interested in countries that haven't been colonized because I think they have a different political sensibility. And so I did work there and wrote a PhD on it. And then I got an opportunity to do more work on Saudi Arabia, which is another country that hasn't been colonized. And so I became a scholar of those countries and of the religion of Islam. And it's sort of a passion that I never thought would become a profession, but it has become a profession.
Well, I guess that area certainly has remained chaotic. Strangely enough, I've been to Yemen. As a kid, my dad was posted as a military attaché to Ethiopia, and we sailed from Bombay to Yemen. And so I got a little bit of a taste for that area and French Somaliland. But yeah, I think your premonition has been on target. By the way, I've heard great things about what Lebanon and Beirut used to be like in the 70s. It was quite a place before the shit hit the fan, wasn't it?
Yes. I mean, Lebanon was a place relative to other Arab countries, very open. It was always a hub for intellectuals and political dissidents, had a great educational system, great medical services. It's also physically beautiful, and it was a fun place where lots of people would come to a sort of a playground for the Middle East where you could gamble and drink and do other things. And that just completely fell apart in 1975 when the Civil War started.
Yeah, that's, what a shame, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Bernie, I thought we'd sort of start with something that most Americans are familiar with, which is, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, two words that every American adult probably knows about. Tell us about their rise to power and what's happening now with the Taliban in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East, and what this all means for the rest of the world now.
Right. So, I mean, the Taliban are a movement, a political movement that is in Afghanistan, and they're in control of the country. They were also in control of the country at an earlier period between 1996 and 2001. And they're a product of a civil war, actually an invasion and a civil war that took place in that country. And I think to understand the Taliban, to understand Osama bin Laden, you have to go back a little bit in history. And you have to remember that after the end of the Second World War, there was a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And a lot of regions in the world, but in particular the Middle East, were sort of pawns on a table, on a sort of like a chessboard between these two superpowers. And you have the rise of what one would call political Islam, or Islamist political movements. These are movements that think of Islam as a political ideology, and they emerged really in the crucible of the Cold War. They were extremely important in how the US and also some countries of the Middle East, including Pakistan, deployed Islam as a religion to fight leftist and communist political movements. I see the Taliban, I see in particular Osama bin Laden, as sort of the tail end of the Cold War, a process that led to the radicalization of many Muslim populations and the emergence of Islamic political movements, really to fight communism and leftism. And so in particular here, we have in 1979 an invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets, then the mobilization of both the Afghan population and also Muslims from around the world by the US and by countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to repulse or repel, to repel the Soviet invasion. And so lots of people were motivated to fight the Soviets, who were infidels, described as infidels, unbelievers, anti-Muslim, and so lots of young men and lots of ideology and resources were deployed against this invasion. That created chaos in Afghanistan. That created a lot of instability. And out of that instability and chaos, the Taliban emerged as the one group that could defeat different warlords who were working for different outside factions. And ultimately, the Taliban took over the country in 1996, and again now with the American withdrawal more recently under President Biden last year.
So what's different about the Taliban this time around than in 1996? What's changed in these last 25 years?
I'm not sure that ideologically they've changed very much. I mean, they're basically they're a movement that belongs to that is dominated by a particular ethno-linguistic group in Afghanistan called the Pashtuns. They basically argue that Islam provides a template for organizing society and politics. They're heavily supported by the Pakistani, have been and I think continue to be heavily supported by Pakistani intelligence. And they argue that Islam is the one way to bring order in a highly tribal and highly divided or fissiparous society like that of Afghanistan. And they have a very kind of extremely crude sort of understanding of Islam and of Islamic politics, and want to impose that crude interpretation on the society, and especially when it comes to women and minorities, discriminating against women and minorities.
When you say crude, do you mean that they're just sort of selectively interpreting Islam or something else?
Yeah, they have a selective interpretation of Islam, but all modern Islamic political movements, so by modern I mean movements that are in the 20th and 21st century, have a very selective or cherry-picked reading of the Islamic tradition. And in addition to that selective reading, they are influenced by modern political ideologies as well. So in the Taliban, you see that, but to a lesser extent. But if you look at Islamic political movements say, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a movement that emerged in Egypt in the 1920s. The ideological influence of the fascists, European fascists, and of communists on the Muslim Brotherhood is just as important as their own view of Islam and how they interpret Islam. So they have a very deliberate reading, a kind of an attempt to modernize Islam by using modern Western political ideologies. Now, they don't admit to this. They don't say, by the way, we're inspired by fascists or by communists. They just say that, our interpretation of Islam is the original, authentic interpretation of Islam, and it has these features that when you look at these features, they look like fascist, elements in their ideology. And again, this is not specific only to Muslim political movements. You have political movements among other religious communities that are also inspired by European ideas, European political ideas.
So, Bernie, in preparation for this conversation, I read the Quran, but I struggled to understand it and realized that there's a lot lost in translation, that you need to know Arabic to make more sense of it. And even then, there's probably a lot of latitude in how to interpret it. Does this ambiguity leave the scripture wide open for selective interpretation and exploitation as a political ideology?
Yeah, so, most people who are non-Muslim, even actually some Muslims, modern Muslims, think of Islam as either a religion, a legal kind of system, or as a political ideology. They think the Quran is what will explain these ideas. In fact, Islamic law is not derived simply from the Quran. The Quran is only one source, and not necessarily the most important source. So there are many other sources of law and of ideas that have to do with what are called hadiths, or the traditions of the Prophet. These are collected sayings of what the Prophet said and did, but also a legal and interpretive tradition that is many centuries in the making. So you have, if you look at the Islamic intellectual tradition, legal tradition, theological tradition, you have many generations of scholars who have commented on each other, who have interpreted the Quran in particular ways, interpreted the traditions of the Prophet in particular ways. This is the Prophet Muhammad. And it's a very complex and highly sophisticated tradition. Most people are not aware that of that complexity, and that it has its own interpretive methodologies. So there's a lot that we would consider today, or many Muslims as well would consider to be Islamic, and that are not, derived from the Quran. They're derived from other sources, including this history of interpretation by the scholars over centuries. So yeah, reading the Quran on its own is not going to explain things, and it's a difficult text. You do need to know Arabic. Even if you know Arabic, you need to also know lots of other methodologies and in the religious sciences to be able to make sense of it.
Yeah, fascinating. So, Bernie, this is my first conversation on the show about religion, which didn't have much of a place in Huxley's Brave New World. My experience, and someone under 40 might not actually appreciate this, is that while we haven't exactly achieved, Lenin's Brotherhood of Man, we've actually made, pretty significant strides in race relations, whereas I don't think I can say the same for sort of interreligious harmony. So we still see sort of religions clashing, and we see this going on now as we speak. So are religious clashes, specifically between Islam and other religions, on the rise, or are they subsiding? I mean, are we able to make a judgment of that sort at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, a crude sort of a version of an answer by me on this issue is to say it is subsiding, because I think what happened during the Cold War was that religion, in particular Islam, was deliberately mobilized as an ideology against other, ideologies, whether it's communism or leftism, or in the case of India, by Pakistan against India. So against certain forms of nationalism. So in other words, religion is a tool that has been deployed deliberately and remolded in a political fashion to achieve certain political ends. And I think that what we see today, at least from the Arab world, in the Middle East, and in particular from the rich countries of the Gulf, is that religion as a political tool is receding. In other words, you have countries like Saudi Arabia in particular, but also the UAE, who are not interested sponsoring religious movements, political movements, have stopped funding them, have, in fact, are attacking Islamism, Islamist political movements. By attacking, I mean repressing. So if you're an Islamist and you argue for an Islamic political vision for a country like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, or if you're in Oman or in one of the other countries, you'll be arrested, you'll be put in prison, or you'll have to flee and go into exile. So one of the largest concentrations of Islamists in the world, where you have Islamic political activists and ideologues, is London. It's not in the Middle East. London, it has a very interesting sort of law for asylum, for political asylum, and the Islamists know this, so many of them try to go there and base themselves there. So I think it's receding as a force in politics, because states, which, governments, who remain the most important sort of actors internationally, are less interested in religion as a political force.
How recent is this trend? Because I thought that, even until, 10, 15 years ago, that Saudi Arabia was funding a lot of Islamization. I mean, certainly in Kashmir, a lot of this stuff was funded by Saudi Arabia. The money was just coming straight from there. So how recent is this sort of reversal in this trend?
So I think what happened, if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, you're right. They were funding Islamist political movements and actors. And as I said, this was part of a larger strategy to fight their enemies, both domestic and regional, as well as international. Enemies mostly from the left. I think what you see is that a slow realization in Saudi Arabia among Saudi leaders that Islamists are sort of a genie that was created and allowed to come out of the bottle, and you can't kind of bring it back in. And that realization happened in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Iraq was led by Saddam Hussein at the time, and he was ambitious and wanted to take over basically Kuwait's oil resources. And most Islamists at the time, the Muslim Brotherhood movements around the world, sided with secular Iraq. Iraq was a secular nationalist government against Kuwait, a country that had supported and funded many Islamist movements around the world. And so then the Americans showed up in Arabia and pushed the Iraqis back out of Kuwait, and most Islamists sided against the governments of Arabia, whether Saudi, Kuwait, etc., and started criticizing them. So a realization emerged that, here are these guys that we had funded and supported, and yet they turned against us in a moment of crisis. And then 9/11 happens about 11 years later in 2001. Then the realization is plain for all to see that this is a movement that is completely out of control and menacing not just to the United States, but to the very regimes that had supported this ideology, Islamist ideology, that ultimately became radicalized in the form of Al-Qaeda. So then the countries started, under American pressure, to turn against this movement and against this ideology. And we see it progressively getting stronger and stronger in terms of its intensity against Islamism after 9/11. So the Saudis fully turn against this ideology when they declare in 2014 that Islamism is illegal. They ban it. They consider both the Muslim Brotherhood and Hezbollah in Lebanon, this is a Shiite Islamist movement. And by the way, there are two versions of Islamism. One is Sunni and one is Shia, which represent the two major sects in Islam. The Saudi government decides, along with the UAE, that these ideologies and these movements are enemies of the state and they're to be banned. They're considered illegal. And then from 2014 until today, we see like a very sustained effort to shut them down.
So, for the benefit of the audience here that may not be sort of as familiar with these two sects, the Sunni and the Shiite sects, what is the difference between these two Islamist movements? Because they're also at loggerheads with each other, right?
Yeah, so so 85% of all Muslims are Sunni, and about 15% of all Muslims are Shiite. And it gets a bit more complicated, and I won't get into the weeds here, but let's just remain at that level of 85 versus 15. The main difference between these two sects of Islam is a dispute over the question of succession. Who should have succeeded politically and spiritually after the Prophet Muhammad died in the year 632? And the Shiites have a particular version of what should have happened, and the Sunnis have their own version of what happened. And then over time, the differences that began over the question of succession became much more elaborate theologically and legally, so that the differences between the two became more accentuated over time. Now, in the modern period, in the 20th century, the Shiites in Iran, developed a particular ideology that is the dominant ideology of the Islamic revolution that took place in Iran in 1979 under the leadership of a man called Ayatollah Khomeini. And so he has a particular modern interpretation of Shiism that is a political ideology that argues that the top religious cleric in Iran should be the supreme leader, the supreme guide of the Shiite movement, of the entire Islamic world. And so he has this ideology which he developed, and then there are followers of his ideas that you see in places like Lebanon with a movement called Hezbollah, which is an Islamist Shiite political movement that subscribes to Khomeini's ideology and that is very much guided by Iran's leadership. In the Sunni world, you have the group that I mentioned earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood, that emerged in the 1920s in Egypt in reaction to British imperialism and British colonial domination of that country and of the Islamic world in general. And they have their own version of Islamism, of Islamic political ideology that, again, is, as I said, is inspired by fascist and communist ideologies, and that also argues that the entire Muslim world should fall under their rule, under their ideology, and they have their own version of politics that is inspired by Islam, again, by a very selective reading of Islam.
You mentioned sort of the mobilization of Islam as a political ideology. Hasn't it sort of been designed as a political ideology from the get-go?
Yeah. So, I mean, Islam as a religion, other religions, Christianity, Hinduism, is much more explicit about politics. So, it from the very start, it had a political leadership that pushed for the expansion of the territory of the Islamic State, for bringing Islam as a religion through conversion to other populations. It saw itself as being perpetually at war with non-Muslims, although you have periods of truces and so on. That's in theory. In practice, it also got much messier. So you had different Muslim dynasties fighting each other, as much as fighting non-Muslims. But there is in the religion a vision of politics that's much more explicit than say in Christianity or in Hinduism. But the modern version of it is different, again, from the pre-modern version. And in the pre-modern version of Islam, you would have, a sultan, a political ruler, say the Ottoman Sultan, the head of the Ottoman Empire, or let's say the Mughal emperor in India. And, he would invoke Islam, to justify what he did. But essentially, it was an empire like other empires, like the Chinese Empire or some of the European empires. They expanded to dominate and control more land and territory and people, to expand their tax base, and used Islam to justify it. But, I don't see it as all that different from other non-Muslim empires in terms of what they did and how they expanded their territory. The modern version is different. It's no longer that idea of an empire. It's more like a political ideology that wants to capture the state, wants to impose law through the state, and those are things that pre-modern Muslim empires were not particularly interested in and didn't have that ideology.
You know, the fact that the religion is a political ideology, does that fundamentally hamper the separation of church and state that we talk about so much in the West?
Not really, because in pre-modern Islamic history, the state was always a source of corruption. So the religion emerges mostly from the society, from below. So the religious scholars were very rarely employees of the state. The state didn't impose the religious law. The law came from the society, as I said. So you always had in Islam, after a period, a glorious period of what they call the rightly guided caliphs, the four successors of the Prophet. After that, there was always a sense that the state was not truly Islamic in terms of its righteousness, and that the ruler often was a despot, was someone who didn't fulfill the qualifications of the position, nor did he really apply Islam properly, and that to understand Islam, you had to almost keep away from the ruler because the ruler would corrupt you. So there is a basis for a separation, and you see it even in the modern period. So let's take the example of Saudi Arabia today. So in Saudi Arabia, you have a monarchy, you have a dynasty, a family that rules, and so you have a king and a crown prince, and you have a religious establishment of clerics, of people who are experts in Islamic law and Islamic theology and so on. And for the longest period, from the 18th century until recently, the Saudi dynasty said they ruled in the name of Islam, that Islam was the source of their legitimacy, and a particular interpretation of Islam, which is a very kind of rigid and literalist interpretation, was the basis of their legitimacy. Now, today, as we speak, you have a kind of a new version of political legitimacy emerging in Saudi Arabia. So the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is saying, Islam is great. Yes, we are a Muslim country. I respect the scholars, but their opinion doesn't really matter. Their views on X or Y is not what determines the policies of this country. What determines the policies of this country, that is Saudi Arabia, are the interests of the country. And I, the ruler, will determine what the interests of the country are. And if those interests clash with a particular version of Islam or particular interpretation, well, too bad. What really will determine how Saudi Arabia is led is a determination about national interests, not religious interpretation, or not a particular religious view of what should or shouldn't be the policy of the country. So he's, in effect, creating that distance between the religious and the political. And we see this in country after country after country.
I guess, what I was getting at with my previous remark was this difficulty for institutions to emerge in the Islamic world, right? That somehow they're sort of ruled, either the clergy's in power or there's a royal family but there's this lack of strong, trustable institutions. In a previous conversation with James Robinson, we were discussing his book called The Narrow Corridor, where he talks about liberal democracies sort of thrive when there's sort of a balance of power, between the people and the state. And somehow Islamic countries have sort of struggled to create institutions. Yes, these institutions may be corrupt, but in the West, we sort of almost dogmatic about the separation. The religion is your private life, but it doesn't interfere, or it doesn't play a major role in institutions and civic life. Whereas in Islamic countries, it seems to play a much larger role. And I'm wondering whether that prevents the emergence of sort of strong institutions and flourishing sort of liberal democracy. Why don't we see that in the Islamic world?
Well, I mean, what you see is authoritarianism across much of the Islamic world, although not in every place. I mean, if you look at countries like Indonesia, to some extent Malaysia, there you actually do see a kind of democratic form of government with a separation of powers.
Yes, and yet even in democratic Malaysia, non-Muslims are second-class citizens according to specific articles in the constitution which give Muslim Malays preferential treatment relative to the Chinese and Indian minorities.
So in the case of Malaysia, I think to explain the politics there and the domination of the Malays over the Chinese, you have to go back to British colonial history and how the country was created. And so I don't know if Islam would explain the tensions between the Malays and the Chinese as much as more recent colonial history and the balance of power between ethno-religious communities. But in the Muslim world, but just like in China, for instance, and in other parts of, Vietnam and North Korea, I mean, you do have Russia, I mean, you do have autocratic governments, and yet those other countries are not Muslim. So, and if you take the example of Turkey, yes, Turkey is moving more and more towards an autocratic form of populist autocratic government with President Erdogan. But you do have institutions there and a separation of powers between parliament, judiciary, and an executive. So I don't know if Islam on its own explains it. I think that there are other factors to do with, as I said earlier, the Cold War. In the case of Saudi Arabia, you have oil. Oil plays a big factor in the political economy. It gives the state tremendous power. It becomes the principal engine of economic activity in the country, which then makes other groups in society less important, less powerful. When you don't have a tax base like you don't in Saudi Arabia or in the UAE or in Kuwait, why should the executive be accountable? They don't tax their people. They give their people all kinds of entitlements, and the state redistributes oil wealth. So again, there are individual cases which I don't think are explained by Islam per se, But that said, if you look at the Islamic tradition, there are Muslims who are trying to argue, no, we do have a form of separation of powers. The executive was always constrained by the judiciary, by the religious scholars. It's true we don't have a legislative form of government, but it's one that some Muslims have tried to argue can be found in the tradition. So many Muslim countries have tried to look more and more like liberal democracies, at least on paper, and try to make Islam accept that form of government with with limitations on the executive. Essentially, how do you control the executive from becoming despotic is a problem that Muslim legal tradition, Muslim society has dealt with for a very long time. Now, it came up with different solutions than the Western model, the Western liberal model. I mean, in the Western liberal model, you basically have a parliament or a legislative body that tries to check the power of the executive. In the Islamic tradition, the check on the executive has been religious law, that the executive authority should abide by Islamic law because Islamic law doesn't sanction despotism, does not allow for, it places limitations on what the ruler can and cannot do. So it's a different answer to a similar set of problems that those societies have also faced.
What do Americans need to understand about Islam? And let me preface this by, I don't know if you saw this Sacha Cohen, the Borat YouTube clip from Kingman, Arizona, that uses comedy to shine a light on how many Americans view Islam. Are people in Kingman, Arizona, or Americans in general, getting Islam wrong? As funny as the clip is, you could sort of sense, the tension and anger in the spoof where Borat announces that we're going to build the largest mosque outside of Saudi Arabia in Kingman, Arizona, which will become a world tourist attraction and boost the economy. The skit was hilarious on the one hand, but the scenario was alarming to its residents, with one of them saying, "We don't want that shit here." Do mainstream Americans have Islam all wrong as being militant and implacable and missionary with its own set of laws that don't fit easily into a secular society?
Well, first of all, I think that, what I hope most Americans would feel and understand is that Islam as a religion is a very complex phenomenon in the world. It's not one thing, right? It's many different things. So let's take the example of the United States. So in the United States, we have about the numbers vary, but, let's say between 4 and 6 or 7 million Muslims. They're extremely diverse, right? They're not one thing. Most of them are, I think the plurality is African American Muslims, so people who've been in the U.S., for as long as the Americas have existed in terms of European colonial rule. You also have South Asians, and you have Arabs, and you have then Muslims from other parts of the world. So it's a very diverse community, and it's also a very prosperous community, right? So it's a community that has done extremely well in the United States, economically and in terms of living in the U.S. The other thing that I think most Americans should understand is that when we think of the kind of media portrayal of Islam as consisting of radical jihadists, violent people, when you look at the Muslim world has 1.5 billion people in it. About the number of jihadists that this world has generated. Again, remembering what I said earlier in the context of the Cold War. So jihadism is a phenomenon of the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. We're talking about a few tens of thousands of people, right, who become jihadists. So statistically kind of insignificant, numerically speaking, in terms of the broader world community of Muslims. We're not talking about many people at all. And very often they're people who have mobilized in the name of Islam, in the name of a particular interpretation of Islam, for very specific reasons in very specific contexts. So you can't generalize from the jihadis to say that this is what the whole religion is about. It isn't. And then I would say that, look at where, Muslims want to be, right? What do they want in the world? So, most wealthy Muslims, when they become wealthy, tend to put their money in the West or in Western financial institutions. They tend to want Western education for their children. They want Western medicine and science for themselves and their societies. They're not anti-Western, right? They very much have kind of the West as a model. And if you look at Islamic political movements, also, they've very much been influenced by the West. So, this is not a world that is outside the West. It's integral to the West. Yes, there have been historical tensions. There have been wars between countries that are quote unquote Christian and other countries that are quote unquote Muslims, and Islam and Christianity have both been deployed as ideologies against one another. You now have it in India between Hindu nationalism and Islam. But I think that you have to look at specific contexts, you have to look at specific interpretations, and not make these gross generalizations about a world religion with 1.5 billion people that is extremely diverse internally, right? So there are lots of internal differences, ethnic, religious, linguistic, between Muslims. And just taking the jihadis as an example, so let's look at these tens of thousands of jihadis out of this wider world of Muslims. Where's their violence been mostly directed? So we have these spectacular attacks like 9/11 and the London bombings, the Madrid bombings, and so on. But most victims of jihadis are other Muslims. I mean, they've killed many more Muslims in their attacks deliberately than they have non-Muslims. So what does that say about them, right? It's those divisions between us and them are not as clear-cut when you look at just that one statistic about how many more Muslims they've killed.
So that's very interesting, the diversity within the Islamic world that you talk about, and the fact that the jihadis are relatively small in number. But criticism from within the Muslim community about the damage they do seems to be very muted or non-existent in the Western media. Is it because of the weight of the religion? I was watching a moderate Muslim journalist in Kashmir recently justifying the fatwa on Salman Rushdie in 1989 as appropriate, which just seems bizarre to me in this day and age. So why is this self-criticism about Islamic extremism so muted? Or am I just mistaken?
I mean, look, the way I see the vast majority of Muslims and Muslim countries, I think of people who are economically underdeveloped. I think of people who live under authoritarian and fairly repressive regimes. in most places. I also see a region of the world that is highly penetrated, by outside powers, whether it's the US or the Russians or the Chinese, or in the case of, let's say, the Muslims in Kashmir, by Pakistan, by states who are constantly meddling and deploying Islam for political purposes. I don't see sort of a open marketplace of ideas when it comes to discussing some of these issues. Also, jihadists are extremely violent people. And as I said earlier, they're mostly violent against other Muslims. So, if you take them on, at great peril to yourself, to your own safety. But jihadists have been criticized by Muslims, by Muslim authorities, by Muslim states. I mean, Saudi Arabia, your life chances are numbered in days if you're a jihadist. I mean, the state will come after you and will kill you. And often it's other Saudis, civilians, ordinary people who indicate to the state, who give the intelligence to the state that here's a jihadist living in this neighborhood, come and get him. So people do turn against them and have done repeatedly, again, because they're very violent and mostly violent against other Muslims. So is there a debate within the Muslim world that's open about all these issues? No, not obviously one to people who don't speak different languages of the Muslim world. It's not happening in English. It's not happening on the op-ed pages of the New York Times. But it definitely, I think, is happening, and it takes different forms. And as I said, the jihadists are very much in decline and on retreat, except in sub-Saharan Africa, by the way, which is the kind of one area of the world where the jihadists seem to be on the rise for reasons to do with the politics of sub-Saharan Africa. But I think most Muslims look at the jihadists, they see violent people, they see failed models too. I mean, they see the jihadists as having tried to build a state in Iraq and Syria under ISIS, and it was a living hell on earth, and they want to have nothing to do with it. But again, one has to break down some of these categories and not think in these broad, like all of Islam, all of Muslims, because the reality is just much more complicated. I mean, as you know yourself, from Kashmir, interpersonal relations between Muslims and non-Muslims one-on-one are extremely warm and friendly and not sort of hostile. Also, that there are different kinds of Kashmiri Muslims, and often they don't like each other. Sufis don't like, Salafis, or, who don't like Shiites. So there are a lot of internal divisions within the Muslim community itself that sometimes, by the way, are much more intense than the divisions and the hostilities with non-Muslims.
I mean, indeed. I mean, I think sort of sectarianism seems to be a feature of the subcontinent as opposed to any religion.
Yeah, and I think that when we think about religion as a political ideology, you always have to ask the question, like, who's saying this? Why are they saying it? Who's backing them? Is Pakistan behind them? Are the Saudis behind them? Which state is behind them? What purposes is it serving? Why does this sound a lot like fascism and not really like a pre-modern form of the religion? So it's more complicated than this, and you should never take Islamists or jihadists or people at what they say at face value, right? Because they present themselves as like this authentic reproduction of 7th century Islam. No, it's not 7th century Islam. It's actually 21st century Islam, and it's this hybrid, eclectic, highly kind of weird form of the religion that no pre-modern person would ever recognize as being authentic.
So, Bernie, you mentioned you're in India, and I think where are you at the moment in India?
I'm in Bangalore, actually. I'm in the south, which is a fascinating part of the country, by the way.
So, I was in India last week myself, when this whole sort of storm began with the BJP spokesperson and the other individual. It took me a long time to actually find a clip of that, right? Because the internet is pretty amazing that way, right? This thing happened, and it's impossibly difficult to find out exactly what was said. But I did actually find a little clip, of that exchange. What's your reading of the situation there?
My very a crude reading, let's say, of Indian politics, of which I'm not an expert, is that, you have a dominant political party that for electoral purposes often deploys an anti-Muslim rhetoric that's against Muslims, and it seems to work well for electoral success. It seems to mobilize people to vote for this party, or enough people to vote for this party to keep it in power. I see 200 million Muslims in India who represent about 14% of the population, who are mostly the poorest, along with Dalits, the poorest and the most marginalized people in the country. They're also, by the way, extremely diverse. Muslims in India are not of one kind. There are many different groups and sects. And then I see foreign countries as using Islam and questions to do with Islam for their own purposes. So if we look at this most recent episode where a woman, I think her name was Nipur Sharma, if I'm not mistaken, who said something about the Prophet and how he'd married a 9-year-old, and so this was regarded as insulting to the Prophet. So the first reaction, it seems, to this statement by she was a BJP spokesperson. The first reaction to this person's statements, was from certain elements within Muslim society here in India, who then and this was then picked up by Qatar, I think, the state of Qatar, which in competition with other Muslim states in the region tried to show its Islamic bona fides by defending the Prophet. So it was a kind of cheap shot to burnish the Qatari government's credentials as an Islamic defender, a defender of Islam. And then once the Qataris did it, they couldn't possibly be allowed to do it without being, as it were, outbid by other countries in the region. So the Omanis then jumped on the bandwagon and said, no, we must also defend the honor of the Prophet. Then once the Omanis and the Qataris did it, the UAE and the Saudis and the Turks and the Iranians and all these others started jumping on the bandwagon. Again, because, it domestically, it has currency, right? So in each of these countries and in their regional rivalry, to quote unquote defend the honor of the Prophet, makes you look good, in front of your own people. So I think when you look at this episode, I think the Prophet has almost nothing to do with with what's happening. It's more like this competition between different states, and each of which is trying to use this to gain more and more political capital, either vis-a-vis each other or with their own publics. And then the Indian government backed off and said, we'll fire this person, and we don't insult religions here in India. And I think the conclusion for the BJP, for the ruling party, will be, don't attack the Prophet Islam or don't attack the religion, but, you can keep discriminating against Muslims because electorally that produces results for you. And which I think is very problematic, because to exclude such a large community of people and to target them is not good for the long term. And the one other thing I would add about India, which is fascinating and to which I don't really have an answer. So as I said, you have 200 million Muslims in India. They've produced, in terms of global jihadis, these guys who go and fight with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I think just like 100 people or 150 people. I mean, for a 200 million community to only have 100 or 150 radicals who sign up for this global jihadist ideology is truly remarkable. I mean, Tunisia produced, several, like 5,000 or 6,000 jihadis, and Tunisia is only 10 million people. So it's remarkable that the Indian Muslim community produces so few jihadis. And I think that begs the question, like, why? I mean, I'm talking outside Kashmir, okay? I'm not talking about the Kashmiri Muslims. That's a specific situation. But outside of Kashmir, it's just utterly remarkable how few jihadis the Indians have produced. And there are various interpretations as to why that is.
That is an interesting observation indeed. So, Bernie, you referred to Islamism a few times, and I sort of want to come back to this. So is this a new thing, or is it a reversion to the past along with some of these sort of modern day mutations that you're talking about? And I ask this question because it seems to me that the Islam of the early days was open to critical thinking and examination of the texts, possible reinterpretations of the text. Islam contributed a lot to art, literature. There was this sort of golden age of Islam when it was sort of open to science, the arts, gave a lot to European civilization. What went wrong after that? What's led to sort of the situation that we see today? Did it lose its way in some ways? What happened?
Yeah, so, I mean, this idea, what you're asking is, so it's often framed as like, why did Muslim civilization decline? Is the way it's often phrased in the literature. There's no question that I think Muslim imperial powers lost militarily, lost technologically to the West, and this presented a crisis, an intellectual crisis, that then the answer to which has been, I guess, of two kinds. So Muslim societies, countries like Turkey, for instance, basically said, no, we must become like the West. We must just emulate the West and become Western. Another answer to this dilemma of political and military decline has been sort of the Bin Laden answer, which is that, the reason we're weak is because we've lost our true Islamic faith and our true Islamic identity. We have to go back to some original interpretation of Islam, and if we regain that original interpretation, then we can regain our power as a civilization and as a people. I think, the Bin Laden view is a highly constructed, highly contrived and artificial interpretation of the religion. The answer to the decline of these societies has to do, I think, with, politics. You have despotism that really, diminishes the dynamism of these societies. But you also have the rise of the West. The West is a very major intellectual, military challenge to these societies. And not just to the Muslim societies, but also to India and to China. And you've had different answers to that challenge. So the Chinese, basically, as you can see, they have authoritarianism plus technological and economic capitalism and dynamism, that combination. The Koreans have come up with their own answer. The Japanese have their answer. But this is a global challenge, I think, to all non-Western societies and not specific to Islam. And these societies have come up with different answers to this challenge. Ultimately, it seems to me that the answer has to do with competing with the West. I mean, adapting Western ideas, Western technological processes, maybe even institutions from the West to compete with them, just like the Chinese are doing extremely effectively, as the Japanese did earlier.
So are there sort of vigorous debates happening among Islamic scholars these days? Christianity sort of went through this sort of reformation, right? The Enlightenment, critical thinking.
That destroyed Christianity.
Reason.
Ultimately it dethroned Christianity, right?
Indeed. The way to ask this question is, what should we expect to see with Islam going forward? I mean, are we going to see sort of some sort of a reformation, or is it more complex than that?
I don't think that this analogy with the Reformation is very useful. First of all, when people think of the Reformation, they forget the wars of religion that took place in Europe that led to the death and destruction and wars, deaths of tens of millions of people. If you look at just the 30 Years' War in Europe. So this was an extremely bloody process. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, not on Muslims or anyone. So it's not a simple thing. It's not like one day Europeans woke up and they became rational thinkers and then the rest just flowed from that. It's a complex process. I don't think it's one that can be replicated and reproduced, frankly, anywhere in the world. It has very specific kind of specific aspects to it. In the Muslim world, there's definitely a debate about, should we follow the Chinese model? Should we follow the Western model? Is authoritarianism with capitalism the solution, or is democracy and capitalism the solution, or should we now evolve towards something else, like an eco-socialism? So you do have these debates among different people, not just people who are inspired by Islam, by the way. I mean, people who are leftists and capitalists and liberals. But always remember that in the world that spans from Morocco to Pakistan, we're dealing with countries that are fairly repressive. I mean, have governments that are very repressive, in some cases extremely repressive. So the debate that takes place about Islam and its place in the world is often happening in the West among Muslims, not just in that part, not just in the quote Muslim world, where Muslims are a majority, because in those countries you can't really have an open debate or an open discussion, not just because the jihadis are violent, but because also the governments are violent.
I guess coming back closer to home, how do you contrast treatment of Muslims in America versus Europe? How do you look at them? How are they different? Let's say in America versus France.
Yeah. I mean, they're extremely different because the history, again, is quite different. So firstly, as I alluded to earlier, I mean, the Muslim community in the United States is very diverse, and it has a fairly sizable portion of it is African American. So it's not a product of colonial history in the United States. This is an immigration that, when it comes to non-African Americans, of people who just decided to come here for a variety of reasons as immigrants. In the case of African Americans, there's a very particular history of slavery with all its brutality and violence. So in the U.S., by and large, with the exception of African Americans who still face racism, the Muslim experience has been a very positive one and a very successful one in terms of integration. If you take the example of France, or for that matter, the Netherlands or Germany, each one of them, in the UK, each one of them has Muslim communities that are much more homogeneous in terms of ethnic and national origin. So in the case of France, it's mostly North Africans from Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia, and they tend to live in ghettos. In other words, these exurban or suburban lower income housing complexes called HLMs in French. They face discrimination. They have a very high rate of criminality in these communities, or gangs and drugs, and so they have very particular. They're not as well integrated. The story of Muslim. There are exceptions, of course. There are Muslims who've done very, very well in France. I have a very good friend who's the president of one of the universities of Paris. But on the whole, Muslims in France still face discrimination and still are economically marginalized and politically marginalized. And that history has to do with the Algerian, with French colonialism in Algeria, which was a very brutal colonial experience that lasted for well over a century. So that we don't have that in the U.S. We just don't have that colonial experience with Muslims. We don't carry any of that burden, any of those tensions. And in the French case, it's an unresolved one, and it's one that will continue to play out in ugly ways, unfortunately.
Do you think it's going to get worse?
I don't think. I mean, my sense is if the French state doesn't find ways to attenuate, to lessen the discrimination, yes, it'll probably get worse. The French, not because of jihadism or because of political Islam, although those are forms of politics that French persons of Algerian origin are attracted to, some, as a way of resisting French culture and French politics. But I think the problem in France has less to do with Islam than to do with the Algerian and North African colonial experience. It just so happens that the people are Muslim.
Mm-hmm. So it's sort of more of a cultural...
Yeah, and also a racist one, too. I mean, there is racism against North Africans in
right.
France.
So, Bernie, I don't think this discussion would be complete without reference to Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. His prediction is that this is going to get worse, right? Previously, you had clashes between princes and emperors, and now sort of it's at the level of civilizations. What do you think of that theory?
I mean, Bin Laden loves it, or loved it before he was killed. So a lot of Islamists love that theory because it provides an explanation of global politics that uses religion and religious animosity as an explanation. I think myself, it's just very crude. It's just too macro to explain the world. I think that first of all, Islam is not just one thing. It's divided into so many different states. I think there are 57 Muslim majority countries. They don't function as one. They often at each other's throats. I mean, how do you explain Muslim on Muslim violence in the Clash of Civilizations theory, of global politics? It doesn't work. And I think what the future of politics seems to indicate is not so much Islam versus the West, but rather China against the West. And I don't think that necessarily can be explained in civilization terms either. A lot of the nuance, a lot of the specificity gets lost in a kind of Huntingtonian interpretation of global politics. Again, as I said earlier, most Muslim money, if from petrodollars, is invested in the West. It's not invested in the Muslim world. So if the world was really that divided along civilizational lines, why do so many people from that part of the world want to be part of the West? It doesn't have very powerful explanatory value. I also should say one more thing. I think which this will be my prediction. So after the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was this dominant, victorious power, and it was in search of an enemy, something that would mobilize it again economically, in terms of the military and all these companies that produce weapons and so on. And there was no kind of adversary out there. And then Bin Laden does his attack on 9/11, and for a while we have what is called the War on Terror, that starts with 9/11 and continues, pretty much until the destruction of the Islamic State in 2017-18. In that period, the American security state, the intelligence state, grows like by multiple folds. The budgets for military and for intelligence, for drones, for instance, expands dramatically. And America goes on this rampage through the world, invades Iraq, attacks Islamists and jihadists everywhere, kills a whole bunch of them, imprisons a bunch more in Guantanamo and so on. And, now looks around and says, well, this is not really a worthy enemy. The Muslims, in the form of the jihadis, really didn't put up much of a fight. I mean, they were just, defeated pretty much everywhere. And in Iraq, it was a botched occupation. The U.S. didn't know how to manage that country. It was less a question of military. Whenever the U.S. came up militarily against an enemy in Iraq, it would just defeat them. It just didn't know how to control the country politically after the military defeat, and couldn't deal with the resistance in Iraq, and eventually withdrew. But essentially, what I'm saying is that the Muslim world didn't amount to a worthy enemy. This kind of Huntingtonian view of an enemy, the Muslims are kind of not worthy because they've just been defeated very easily. Now we have Russia, though, and China.
But at great cost, right? I mean, it's cost the U.S. like $7 trillion or something to that effect.
I don't know if it's 7 trillion. I mean, the number that I've heard is between 1 and 3 trillion, but it's mostly self-inflicted, right? I mean, Iraq didn't need to be invaded. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. This is kind of the U.S. on a rampage, and building up this huge, monstrous intelligence and security state that altered all our lives. Now look at how when you travel, what you have to do to get through an airport security. And Americans, have redress numbers and all kinds of, special numbers to get through security clearances more quickly. So it's altered our lives, in very dramatic ways. And ultimately, we haven't had an attack since 9/11 in the United States, right? So this has proved a great disappointment, I think, to a bunch of people who wanted to find an enemy in the United States. Americans who wanted to find an enemy out there. Now we have Russia, and now we have the Ukraine, a real war between, equals, another kind of nuclear state, and the Chinese are kind of real enemies, in the sense of, being able to put up an equal fight in this war. So I think a lot of people will find that Islam and Islamism will recede as a topic and as an issue in the West, because there simply isn't anything there. There's nothing really worthy in terms of an opponent to the West in the Muslim world. This is, the poorest part of the world, the weakest part of the world, and one that, hasn't lived up to the challenge that Huntington would want us to believe.
Bernie, on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank you for sharing your nuanced perspective on Islam with the listeners. Much appreciated. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. I look forward to hearing this podcast and other podcasts. I really love your work. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bernie.